I've driven the Trans-Canada Highway more times than I can count. It is part of my job, hauling freight from Calgary to Winnipeg and back again, week after week, month after month. I know every rest stop, every gas station, every stretch of road where you need to watch for wildlife crossing in the dark. I have driven through blizzards that turned the world into a wall of white, through fog so thick I could barely see the hood of my truck, and through nights so cold that the air itself seemed to crack. But nothing, and I mean nothing, prepared me for what happened on Highway 1, just outside of Medicine Hat, on a February night 3 years ago. I do not talk about it much, because people look at you like you have lost your mind when you tell them you picked up a ghost. But I know what I saw. I know what happened, and I will carry it with me until the day I die. It was late, maybe 0 inches the morning, and the temperature had dropped to -35. The kind of cold that freezes your breath before it leaves your mouth. That makes your truck groan and shudder, even with the heater blasting. There was fresh snow on the road, not enough to make driving dangerous, but enough that you had to pay attention. I was the only vehicle on that stretch of highway. No headlights ahead of me, no taillights behind me, just me and the darkness, and the endless white fields on either side. I had my coffee, my playlist going, and I was settling into that familiar rhythm of a long haul when I saw her. She was standing on the shoulder of the road, right at the edge of my headlights, with her arm out like she was trying to flag me down. A hitchhiker at 0 inches the morning and -35 weather on one of the loneliest stretches of highway in Alberta. My first instinct was to keep driving. You do not stop for hitchhikers at 0 inches the morning, especially not in the middle of nowhere. But then I saw what she was wearing. A thin dress. No coat, no hat, no gloves, just a summer dress like she was heading to a picnic, and she was not moving, not stamping her feet or hugging herself or doing any of the things you do when you are freezing. She was just standing there perfectly still with her arm out. I hit the brakes, without even thinking, because if she was real, if she was actually out there dressed like that, she would be dead in minutes. Hypothermia does not wait. Frostbite does not negotiate. I pulled onto the shoulder and put my hazards on, grabbed the emergency blanket from behind my seat, and rolled down the passenger window. She walked up to the truck, slow and steady, and when she got close enough that the interior light hit her face, I felt something twist in my gut. She was young, maybe 19 or 20, with dark hair and pale skin, and eyes that did not quite focus on anything. She looked tired, lost, like she had been walking for a very long time. I leaned over and opened the passenger door. "Get in," I said. "You're going to freeze to death out here." She climbed up into the cab without a word, moving like she was in a dream, and sat down in the passenger seat. I grabbed the blanket and wrapped it around her shoulders. Her skin was cold to the touch, but not freezing the way it should have been. Not the kind of cold that comes from standing outside in -35 weather, just cool like she had been inside a building with the air conditioning on. That should have been my first clue, but I was too focused on getting her warm and getting back on the road. "Where are you headed?" I asked, pulling back onto the highway. She did not answer right away, just sat there, staring out the windshield, her hands folded in her lap, the blanket draped over her shoulders. I glanced at her a few times, waiting for a response, but she did not even blink. Finally, after what felt like forever, she spoke. Her voice was soft, almost a whisper, and it had this strange quality to it, like it was coming from somewhere far away. "Home," she said. "I need to go home." I nodded, trying to keep my tone calm and reassuring. "Okay, where is home? What is the address?" She gave me a street name and a number. It was in a small town, about 20 kilometers up the road, a place I had passed through 100 times, but never stopped. I knew it would take us maybe 15 minutes to get there. "All right," I said. "I will get you there. Do you want me to call someone?" Your parents? A friend? She shook her head, still staring straight ahead. No, I just need to go home. We drove in silence after that. I tried to make small talk a few times, asking her what she was doing out there, how long she had been walking, if she was okay. But she did not respond. She just sat there completely still, like a statue. I checked the temperature gauge on my dashboard. -36 now. The wind was picking up, blowing snow across the highway in ghostly white sheets. I turned the heater up as high as it would go, but she did not react, did not pull the blanket tighter, did not rub her hands together, nothing. We were about 5 km from the town when I noticed something strange. The blanket had slipped off one of her shoulders, and I could see her arm. There was no goosebumps, no redness from the cold. Her skin was smooth and pale and completely unblemished, like she had never been outside in her life. I felt that twist in my gut again, stronger this time, but I pushed it down. Maybe she was in shock. Maybe her body had shut down from the cold, and she was not processing things properly. I had heard of that happening to people with severe hypothermia. They stop shivering, stop reacting, just go numb. I took the exit into the town and followed her directions, turning onto a quiet residential street lined with small bungalows and snow-covered lawns. She pointed to a house at the end of the block, a pale blue one with a covered porch and a light on above the front door. There, she said, that is home. I pulled up in front of the house and put the truck in park, letting the engine idle. Do you want me to walk you to the door? I asked. Make sure you get inside. Okay. She turned to look at me then, and for the first time since she got in the truck, her eyes focused, really focused. And they were sad. The saddest eyes I have ever seen. Thank you, she said. You're very kind. And then, before I could say anything else, she opened the door and stepped out into the night. I watched her walk up the driveway toward the house, the blanket still wrapped around her shoulders, her bare feet crunching in the snow. She did not look back. She just walked straight to the front door, reached for the handle, and then she was gone. Not inside the house, just gone. 1 second she was there, and the next second she was not. The blanket fell to the ground in a heap where she had been standing. I sat there for a long moment, staring at the empty driveway, my heart pounding in my chest. Then I grabbed my flashlight, got out of the truck, and walked up to the house. I picked up the blanket. It was dry, completely dry. No wetness from the snow, no dampness from her body heat, just dry, like it had been sitting in my truck the whole time. I looked at the front door. There were no footprints leading up to it. None. The snow on the porch was completely undisturbed. I knocked on the door hard and loud because I needed answers. I needed someone to tell me what the hell was going on. After a minute, the porch light flickered on, and the door opened. An older woman stood there in a bathrobe, her gray hair pulled back in a bun, her face lined with age and worry. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice cautious. I told her what had happened, told her I had picked up a young woman on the highway, that she had been standing in the cold with no coat, that I had driven her here, that she had walked up to this house and vanished. The woman's face went white. She stared at me for a long moment, and then she stepped back and gestured for me to come inside. She led me to the living room and pointed to a photograph on the mantel. It was a picture of a young woman in a summer dress, smiling at the camera with dark hair and pale skin and those same sad eyes. "That is my daughter," the woman said, her voice shaking. Her name was Sarah. She died 15 years ago. I felt the room tilt. "What do you mean she died?" The woman wiped her eyes. "She was at a party in Medicine Hat. It was February. Just like tonight. She had a fight with her boyfriend and she left. Started walking home. No coat, no phone, nothing. They found her body the next morning on the side of Highway 1. She froze to death. I could not speak, could not move, could not process what she was telling me. The woman walked over to a drawer and pulled out a small box. Inside was a necklace, a simple silver chain with a locket. She was wearing this when they found her. The woman said, "It is the only thing I have left." She opened the locket, and inside was a picture of the house. This house, the pale blue one, with the covered porch. She was trying to get home, the woman said, her voice breaking. She just wanted to come home. I left after that. Drove straight through to Winnipeg without stopping, without sleeping, without letting myself think too hard about what had happened. But I know what I saw. I know I picked up Sarah on that highway. I know I drove her home, and I know she is still out there, still trying to make it back, still standing on the side of the road in that summer dress, waiting for someone to stop. I do not drive that stretch of Highway 1 at night anymore. I take the long way around, add an extra hour to my route because I cannot go through that again. I cannot see those sad eyes and know that I cannot help her, that no one can help her, that she is trapped in that moment forever, cold and lost, and trying to find her way home. Moving to Montreal was supposed to be a fresh start. I had just finished my degree at McGill, landed a decent job at a marketing firm downtown, and I was ready to stop living with roommates and finally have a place of my own. The apartment I found was perfect on paper. It was in the Plateau, a beautiful old building from the early 1900s with high ceilings, original hardwood floors, and those big bay windows that let in the light. The rent was suspiciously cheap for the neighborhood, but the landlord explained that away easily enough. The building was old, he said. No dishwasher, no air conditioning, and the heating could be temperamental in winter. But I did not care. It was mine, my own space, my own sanctuary in a city I was just beginning to love. I moved in on a Saturday in September, and for the first week, everything was wonderful. I spent my evenings unpacking boxes, arranging furniture, exploring the neighborhood cafes and bookshops. The building was quiet. There were only 4 other units, and I rarely saw my neighbors. An elderly couple on the ground floor who smiled and nodded when we passed in the hallway. A graduate student on the second floor who was always buried in textbooks, and someone on the third floor I never met at all. My apartment was on the second floor at the back of the building, overlooking a small courtyard filled with overgrown ivy and rusted patio furniture. It was peaceful, private, exactly what I needed after years of cramped dorm rooms and shared spaces. The first time I noticed something strange was about 2 weeks after I moved in. I was lying in bed reading, the apartment completely silent, except for the occasional sound of traffic from the street. And then I heard it, a faint, scratching sound, rhythmic and deliberate, coming from somewhere below me. I put my book down and listened. Scratch, 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 like something being dragged across concrete or fingernails against wood. I got out of bed and walked through the apartment, trying to figure out where it was coming from. It seemed to be loudest near the blessed radiator in the living room, coming up through the heating vents. I crouched down and pressed my ear to the grate. The scratching stopped. I waited there for a few minutes, feeling ridiculous, but it did not start again. I went back to bed and convinced myself it was just the building settling. Old buildings make noise. Everyone knows that. But it happened again the next night and the night after that. Always around the same time. Always that same deliberate, scratching sound, and always coming from below. On the 4th night, I heard something else mixed in with the scratching. Voices, muffled and distant, like someone was talking in another room with the door closed. I could not make out the words, but the tone was clear, pleading, desperate, someone begging for something. My stomach knotted. I grabbed my phone and called the landlord, a man named Claude, who lived in Laval and managed several properties around the city. He answered on the 5th ring, his voice thick with sleep. I told him what I was hearing. He was quiet for a long moment, and then he laughed. Not a genuine laugh, a forced one. The kind people make when they are trying to dismiss something they do not want to deal with. It is probably just the pipes, he said. Old buildings, you know, the heating system makes all kinds of sounds. You will get used to it. I told him it did not sound like pipes. It sounded like voices, like someone was down there. He got irritated then, his tone shifting from dismissive to annoyed. There is no one down there, he said. The basement is locked. It has been locked for years. No one has access to it except me. You're hearing the pipes. And then he hung up. I did not sleep much that night. I lay in bed, listening to the scratching and the voices, my mind racing with possibilities. Maybe it was pipes. Maybe it was the couple downstairs watching television. Maybe I was just tired and stressed and imagining things. But I knew what I heard, and I knew it was not pipes. The next morning, I went downstairs and knocked on the door of the elderly couple. The woman answered, her face kind and wrinkled, a dish towel in her hands. I asked her if she had been watching television late at night, if she had heard anything strange coming from below the building. She shook her head. We go to bed at 9, she said, and we have not heard anything. Why is something wrong? I told her about the scratching and the voices. Her expression changed. The kindness drained out of her face, and something else replaced it. Fear. She glanced back into her apartment, then stepped out into the hallway and lowered her voice. Stay away from the basement, she said. Do not ask Claude for the key. Do not go down there. Just leave it alone. I asked her why, what was down there, but she shook her head and went back inside, closing the door firmly behind her. That conversation stayed with me all day. I could not focus at work. I kept thinking about the way she had looked at me, the urgency in her voice. Stay away from the basement. But why? What was down there that she did not want me to see? That night, the sounds were louder. Not just scratching and voices, but banging. Heavy, rhythmic banging like someone pounding on metal. I could not take it anymore. I grabbed a flashlight, put on my shoes, and went looking for the basement door. I had noticed it during my first tour of the building, tucked away in a corner of the ground floor hallway near the back entrance. It was old and wooden, with peeling paint, and a heavy padlock looped through the handle. I stood in front of it, listening. The sounds were coming from the other side. I could hear them clearly now. Scratching, voices banging, and something else. A low humming sound, mechanical and constant, like old equipment running. I pulled out my phone and called Claude again. This time, I did not ask. I demanded. I told him I needed the key to the basement, that there was something down there, that I could hear it through the vents, and I needed to know what it was. He got angry, really angry. His voice rose sharp and hostile. You need to mind your own business, he said. That basement is private property. You have no right to go down there. If you keep bothering me about this, I will evict you. Do you understand? I told him I would call the police if he did not give me the key. He laughed again, that same forced, bitter laugh. Go ahead, he said. Call them. They will tell you the same thing I am telling you. Mind your own business. And then he hung up. I stood there in the hallway staring at that locked door, my heart pounding in my chest. I knew I should listen to him. I knew I should go back to my apartment, put in earplugs, and ignore whatever was happening down there. But I could not. I needed to know. I went back upstairs, grabbed a hammer and a screwdriver from my toolkit, and went back to the basement door. The padlock was old and rusted. It took me less than 5 minutes to break it. The door swung open with a long, low creak, and a wave of cold, stale air hit me in the face. I shone my flashlight down a narrow staircase, that descended into darkness. The humming sound was louder now, and I could hear something else, too. A faint buzzing, like static from a radio. I went down the stairs, slowly, step by step, the beam of my flashlight cutting through the darkness. The basement was larger than I expected, stretching out beneath the entire building. The walls were bare concrete, damp and covered in mold, and the floor was littered with old furniture, broken chairs, rusted tools, and piles of rotting cardboard boxes. In the far corner near the back wall, I saw a table, a long metal table covered in equipment, old audio equipment, Realtor tape recorders, microphones, mixing, boards, all of it connected by a tangle of wires and cables. And next to the table, stacked in neat rows, were dozens of cassette tapes. I walked over to the table, my hands shaking, and picked up one of the tapes. It had a label on it, handwritten in black ink, a name, Jennifer M., and a date, March 14th, 2009. I picked up another tape, David R., June 2012, 2011, another, Sarah L., September 8th, 2013. There were dozens of them, maybe 100, all labeled with names and dates. I felt sick. I picked up one of the tape recorders, an old battered thing that looked like it had been salvaged from a thrift store, and pressed play. The tape inside, word to life, and a voice filled the basement. A woman's voice, terrified, sobbing. "Please," the voice said. "Please, let me go. I will not tell anyone. I promise. Just please let me go." There was a pause, and then another voice. A man's voice, calm, almost bored. "You said that yesterday," the man said, "and the day before that. But you are still here, so I do not believe you." The woman screamed, a raw, desperate scream that echoed through the basement and sent ice down my spine. I stopped the tape, my hands trembling so badly I almost dropped the recorder. I looked at the other tapes, the rows and rows of them, and I understood this was not a storage room. This was an archive, a collection, a record of something terrible. I grabbed my phone and started taking pictures. The equipment, the tapes, everything. I needed evidence. I needed proof of what I was seeing. And then I noticed something that made my blood run cold. On the table at the far end near the wall was another tape. It was newer than the others. The label, crisp and fresh, and written on it in that same black ink was my name, Isabella S., and a date, tomorrow, November 3rd, 2024. I stared at it, my mind refusing to process what I was seeing. My name, my tape, dated for tomorrow. How was that possible? How could there be a recording of me dated for a day that had not happened yet? I grabbed the tape and shoved it in my pocket. Then I grabbed as many of the other tapes as I could carry, stuffing them into my jacket, and I ran. I ran up the stairs, out of the basement, through the hallway, and up to my apartment. I threw everything into a bag, my laptop, my wallet, my keys, and I left. I did not care about my furniture, my dishes, my carefully arranged bookshelves. I just left. I went to a hotel downtown, locked the door, and called the police. I told them everything. The sounds, the basement, the tapes, the one with my name on it. They sent officers to the building. They searched the basement. They found the equipment. They found the tapes. And they found something else. A false wall at the back of the basement, hidden behind a stack of old filing cabinets. Behind that wall was a room, a small windowless room with restraints bolted to the floor and walls covered in soundproofing foam. The building had a history. The police told me 3 tenants had gone missing over the past 15 years. All women, all in their 22nds, all living in the same apartment I had rented. The police had investigated each disappearance, but there was never any evidence. No signs of struggle, no witnesses, nothing. The women had just vanished. The landlord, Chloe, was arrested. They found more tapes in his house in Laval, more recordings, more names. Some of the women had been released, some had not. The investigation is still ongoing. They are still identifying victims, still searching for bodies. I never went back to that apartment. I never even went back for my things. I moved in with a friend, found a new place, and tried to move on. But I cannot stop thinking about that tape, the one with my name on it, dated for the day after I found it. What was on it? What was supposed to happen to me? And how did he know? How did he know I would be there in that basement on that specific night? The police told me it was probably blank, that he had prepared it in advance, that it was meant to intimidate me if I ever got too curious. But I do not believe that, because when I got home from the police station that first night, I made a mistake. I listened to the tape. I put it in an old cassette player I had borrowed from my friend, and I pressed play, and I heard my own voice screaming, begging, pleading for my life. A recording that should not exist. A recording of something that never happened, or at least something that has not happened yet. I've always been drawn to the idea of exploring abandoned places. Something about the silence, the decay, the sense that time has stopped in these forgotten corners of the world. It fascinates me. So, when my buddy Marcus suggested we spend a long weekend hiking through the Yukon wilderness and maybe stumble across some old mining camps or trappers' cabins, I jumped at the chance. This was back in 2019, late September, when the days were getting shorter and the nights were starting to bite with real cold. We flew into Whitehorse, rented a truck, and drove north into the backcountry with nothing but our camping gear, some freeze-dried food, and a vague sense of adventure. The first 2 days were incredible. We hiked through valleys painted gold and red with autumn colors, camped beside crystal-clear streams, and saw more wildlife than I had ever seen in my life. Caribou, eagles, a bear, in the distance that watched us for a moment before lumbering away. It felt like we had stepped into a postcard. On the third day, we veered off the main trail and followed an old creek bed deeper into the forest. Marcus had read somewhere that there were remnants of old fur trading routes in this area, places where trappers used to shelter during the brutal winters. We figured, if we were lucky, we might find one of those cabins still standing. We hiked for hours, pushing through thick brush and scrambling over fallen logs until we came to a clearing. And there it was, a cabin, small, maybe 12 feet, x 12 feet, built from rough, hewn logs that had turned gray with age. The roof was sagging in the middle, and the single window at the front was cracked and covered in grime, but it was intact, still standing after God knows how many years. We looked at each other and grinned. This was exactly what we had been hoping to find. We approached slowly, half expecting the thing to collapse the moment we touched it, but it held. The door was ajar, hanging crooked on rusted hinges, and when Marcus pushed it open, it let out a long, low groan that echoed through the clearing. Inside, the cabin was dark and musty. The air smelled like rot and mildew and something else, something metallic. We shone our flashlights around and took in the scene. There was a cot in one corner, the frame rusted, and the mattress long since disintegrated into moldy clumps of fabric. A small wood stove sat in the center of the room, its chimney pipe collapsed and lying in pieces on the floor, and along the far wall, a crude wooden table with a chair overturned beside it. The table was covered in dust and debris, but there was something on it, a book, a journal. Marcus picked it up and blew the dust off the cover. The leather was cracked and stained, and when he opened it, the pages crinkled like dry leaves. The handwriting inside was small and cramped, written in faded ink that was hard to read in the dim light, but we could make out enough. The journal belonged to a trapper named Albert Fallner. The first entries were mundane, notes about trap lines, weather, conditions, animal sightings. But as we flipped through the pages, the tone changed. The handwriting became more erratic, the entries more frantic. Albert started writing about feeling watched, about hearing footsteps outside the cabin at night, about seeing shadows moving between the trees. He wrote about his dogs going missing one by one, about finding their bodies torn apart and scattered in the snow. And then he wrote about the men. He said there were men in the forest, men who did not belong there, men who watched him from the treeing but never came closer. He described them as gaunt and hollow-eyed, dressed in tattered furs, their faces pale as death. He said they followed him when he checked his traps, always staying just out of sight, always watching. He wrote that he tried to shoot one of them, but his rifle jammed. He tried to leave to hike out to the nearest settlement, but he got lost, kept ending up back at the cabin no matter which direction he walked. The final entry was dated February 17th, 1932. It was short, just 3 sentences. They at the door. I can hear them, breathing. God forgive me for what I have done. We stood there in the cabin, reading those words, and the temperature seemed to drop 10 degrees. Marcus closed the journal and set it back on the table, his hands shaking. This is messed up, he said. I agreed, but I was also intrigued. I wanted to know more. I wanted to know what happened to Albert Faulkner, whether he died here in this cabin, or whether he somehow made it out. I started looking around more carefully, searching for clues. That is when I noticed the marks on the walls. Long, deep gouges carved into the wood, running from floor to ceiling. They were everywhere, on every wall. Some of them looked like claw marks, others looked deliberate, almost like tally marks, like someone had been counting something. And then I saw the stains, dark brown stains on the floor, near the cot spattered across the wall behind it. Dried blood, a lot of it. Marcus saw it too, and his face went pale. We should go, he said. I nodded, but before we could leave, I noticed something else. Scratched into the wood above the door, barely visible in the dim light were words, crude letters carved deep into the timber. They are still here. My stomach dropped. We backed out of the cabin slowly, neither of us saying a word, and stepped back into the clearing. The sun was lower now, casting long shadows through the trees, and the forest that had seemed so beautiful and peaceful just hours ago now felt oppressive, menacing, like it was closing in around us. We decided to set up camp a few hundred yards away from the cabin, far enough that we would not have to look at it, but close enough that we would not get lost, trying to find our way back to the trail in the dark. We built a fire, cooked some food, and tried to convince ourselves that what we had seen in the cabin was just the paranoid ramblings of a man who had spent too much time alone in the wilderness. People go crazy in isolation. It happens. The journal was just evidence of that, nothing more. But as the sun set and the darkness crept in, I could not shake the feeling that we were being watched. That same feeling Albert had written about. I kept glancing over my shoulder, scanning the treeing, half expecting to see those gaunt, hollow-eyed men he had described. Around midnight, we heard it. Footsteps, slow, deliberate footsteps circling our camp. I sat up, my heart pounding, and grabbed my flashlight. Marcus was already awake, his eyes wide and locked on the darkness beyond the firelight. Do you hear that? He whispered. I nodded. The footsteps were getting closer. I shone my flashlight into the trees, sweeping the beam back and forth, but I could not see anything. Just shadows and branches in the faint glint of animal eyes in the distance. The footsteps stopped, and then we heard something else, breathing. Heavy, ragged breathing coming from just outside the body, edge of the light. I stood up, gripping my flashlight like a weapon, and took a step toward the sound. Who is there? I called out. No response. Just that breathing, and then slowly, a figure stepped into the light. It was a man, or at least it had been a man once. He was tall and impossibly thin, his skin stretched tight over his bones, his eyes sunken deep into his skull. He was wearing tattered furs that hung off his frame like rags, and his hands were caked with dirt and something darker, blood. He stood there, swaying slightly, staring at us with those hollow eyes. And then he smiled, a wide, unnatural smile that showed too many teeth. "You found the cabin," he said, his voice a dry rasp. "Albert's cabin." I could not move, could not speak. I just stood there frozen as the man took another step closer. Marcus grabbed my arm and yanked me back. "Run," he hissed. And we did. We ran blindly into the forest, crashing through the underbrush, branches whipping at our faces, our flashlights bouncing wildly in the darkness. I do not know how long we ran. It felt like hours. We could hear footsteps behind us, multiple sets of footsteps and voices calling out to us in that same dry, rasping tone. "Come back. We just want to talk. We have been waiting so long." We did not stop. We did not look back. We just kept running until we burst out onto the trail we had hiked in on, and then we kept going until we reached the truck. We threw our gear in the back, jumped in, and drove. We drove all night, not stopping until we hit White Horse. And even then, we did not feel safe. We checked into a hotel, locked the door, and sat there in silence, trying to process what had happened. The next day, we went to the RCMP and told them what we had found. The cabin, the journal, the blood, the man. They listened politely, took notes, and said they would send someone to investigate. A week later, I got a call from an officer. Journal, no bloodstains, nothing. The cabin was empty, just an old abandoned structure slowly being reclaimed by the forest. He suggested that maybe we had gotten disoriented. Maybe we had imagined things. Maybe the isolation and the darkness had played tricks on us. But I know what we saw. I know what we heard. And I know we were not alone in those woods. I did some research after we got back. Looked into the name, Albert Fner. Turned out he was a real person. A trapper who worked the Yukon Territory in the late 1920 seconds and early 1930 seconds. In 1932, he was involved in a manhunt, not as a victim, as a suspect. He and two other trappers were accused of murdering 3 Royal Canadian Mounted Police officers who had come to arrest him for trapping violations. The manhunt lasted weeks, one of the largest in Canadian history at the time. They called him the Mad Trapper of Rat River. Eventually, they cornered him and shot him, or at least they shot someone. The body was never positively identified, and there were always rumors that Albert had escaped, that he was still out there, in the wilderness living like an animal. The men who helped him, the other trappers, were never found. They vanished into the forest and were never seen again. I think about that cabin a lot, about the journal that the police said was not there, about the man with the hollow eyes and the too wide smile, about the voices calling out to us in the darkness. And I think about Albert Fallner and the men who vanished with him. I think they are still out there, still waiting, still watching. And I think anyone who finds that cabin, anyone who steps inside and reads those words carved above the door, becomes part of whatever curse or madness took hold of them all those years ago. We got out. We were lucky. But I will never go back to the Yukon. Not to those woods. Not to that place where civilization ends and something far older and far darker takes over. I never believed in ghosts. Not really. I was always the skeptical one in my group of friends, the one who would roll her eyes at paranormal shows and laugh off stories about haunted houses. So, when I signed up for a winter expedition along the Mackenzie River in the Northwest Territories, I was not thinking about spirits or supernatural encounters. I was thinking about adventure, about pushing myself, physically and mentally, about experiencing one of the most remote and unforgiving landscapes on Earth. The expedition was organized by a small, outfitting company based in Yellowknife, and it promised 3 weeks of dog sledding, camping in sub-zero temperatures, and traveling along historic fur trading routes that had not changed much in 200 years. There were 6 of us in total: me, 2 other women, and 3 men, plus our guide, a weathered Dean man in his 60s named Joseph, who had been running expeditions in the north for over 30 years. We left Yellowknife in early February, when the days were short and the nights stretched endlessly, and we traveled north toward Fort Simpson, following the frozen Mackenzie River. The cold was unlike anything I had ever experienced. -40 on a good day. -50 when the wind picked up. The kind of cold that makes your lungs burn when you breathe. That freezes your eyelashes together if you blink too slowly. That turns exposed skin white and numb in seconds. But it was also stunningly beautiful. The river stretched out before us like a highway, made of ice, flanked on both sides by dense forests of black spruce and white birch. The sky was vast and clear, filled with stars so bright they seemed to hum. And at night, the aurora borealis danced overhead in curtains of green and purple light. For the first week, everything went smoothly. We fell into a rhythm. Wake before dawn, break camp, harness the dogs, and travel. We covered about 30 kilometers a day, stopping only to rest the dogs and eat quick meals of dried meat and hot soup. At night, we pitched our tents on the ice, huddled together for warmth, and told stories until we were too tired to keep our eyes open. It was on the 8th night that things started to feel different. We had camped near a spot Joseph called Deadman's Bend, a sharp curve in the Coe River where the ice was thicker and the wind seemed to die down. He told us the area had a history. Back in the 1800s, fur traders used this route to transport goods between trading posts, and during the brutal winters, many of them froze to death along the way. Their bodies were often left where they fell, too, frozen to bury. And in the spring, they would be picked up and transported to the nearest settlement. Joseph said some of the old-timers believed the spirits of those traders still walked the river forever, trying to complete their journeys. I laughed it off. Just a campfire story, I thought. But that night, as I lay in my sleeping bag, listening to the wind howl across the ice, I heard something that made my blood run cold. A voice, a man's voice shouting. It was distant, muffled by the wind, but clear enough that I could make out the words: march, walk, keep moving. The command was in French, sharp and urgent, and it seemed to be coming from somewhere out on the ice. I sat up, my heart pounding, and looked at the others. Sarah, one of the women in our group, was already awake, her eyes wide, in the darkness. "Did you hear that?" she whispered. I nodded. We listened. The voice came again. March, walk. It was closer now, almost like it was circling our camp. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent, stepping out into the freezing night. The others followed, and we stood there in a tight circle, our breaths hanging in the air like frozen clouds, shining our lights out onto the cloud ice. There was nothing, no one, just the endless expanse of white, stretching out in every direction, and the wind howling through the trees on the riverbank. Joseph emerged from his tent, pulling on his parka, and looked at us with an expression I could not quite read. Not surprise, not fear, just a kind of weary resignation. "You heard the voice," he said. It was not a question. We nodded. He sighed and gestured for us to come closer. "The traitors," he said. "They are still here. Some of them, anyway, the ones who died on the ice. They do not know they are dead. They think they are still working, still moving goods from one post to another. And sometimes when the conditions are right, when it is cold enough and quiet enough, you can hear them shouting at their dogs, giving commands, trying to finish the job. I wanted to argue to tell him it was just the wind playing tricks on our ears, but I could not because the voice had been too clear, too real. And it was not just me who had heard it. All of us had. We went back to our tents, but none of us slept that night. Every time I started to drift off, I would hear it again, that voice calling out in the darkness. Mare, walk, keep moving. And in the darkness, morning when we broke camp and harnessed the dogs, Joseph pointed out something I had not noticed the night before. Tracks. Not dog tracks, not human tracks. Something in between. Long, narrow impressions in the snow leading away from our camp and disappearing into the distance. He did not say anything about them, and neither did we. We just loaded up the sleds and kept moving. That night the voice came again, and the night after that, always the same, always in French, always commanding the dogs to march, to keep walking, to push through the cold. It became almost routine. We would hear it, we would acknowledge it, and then we would try to ignore it and get some sleep. But on the 11th night, something changed. We were camped on a wide stretch of the river, far from any trees, with nothing but ice and sky in every direction. The aurora was particularly bright that night, casting strange green shadows across the snow, and the dogs were restless. They kept barking and pulling at their chains, their eyes fixed on something we could not see. And then the voice came, but this time it was not distant. It was right next to us, right there in the camp. March, walk, keep moving. I spun around, shining my flashlight in the direction of the voice. And for a split second, I saw him. A man, tall and gaunt, dressed in tattered furs and a wool cap pulled low over his face. He was standing, maybe 10 feet away from me, his breath steaming in the cold air, his eyes locked on mine, and then he was gone, just vanished, like he had never been there at all. I stumbled backward, nearly tripping over my own feet, and Sarah grabbed my arm to steady me. "Did you see that?" I gasped. She nodded, her face pale. The others had seen it too. We all had. Joseph walked over to where the man had been standing and crouched down, examining the snow. There were no footprints, no marks, nothing. He stood up and looked at us, his expression grim. "That was Augustus," he said. "Augustus Richard Pierce. He was a trader with the Dupin Hudson's Bay Company back in the 1852. Died on this stretch of river during a particularly brutal winter. His body was frozen solid, and his partners had to transport it on a sled all the way to Fort Simpson. Took them weeks, and the whole time they said they could hear him, shouting at the dogs, telling them to march, to keep moving, even though he was dead. I felt sick. The idea that we had been hearing the voice of a dead man, that we had seen his ghost standing in our camp, it was too much. I wanted to leave. I wanted to pack up and go home, but we were in the middle of nowhere, hundreds of kilometers from the nearest town. There was no way out, except to keep moving forward. So we did. We kept traveling along the river, and every night the voice came, sometimes distant, sometimes close, always the same command: march, walk, keep moving, and sometimes in the pale light of the aurora, we would see him. Augustus, standing on the ice, watching us, his face blank and expressionless, his lips moving, but no sound coming out except for that one endless command. By the time we reached Fort Simpson 3 weeks later, I was exhausted, not just physically, but mentally. The constant cold, the lack of sleep, the nightly encounters with something that should not exist. It had all taken a toll. We said goodbye to Joseph, thanked him for guiding us, and flew back to Yellowknife. I spent a week in a hotel room, just sleeping and trying to process what had happened. And when I finally felt ready to talk about it, I started researching. I wanted to know if there were any records of Augustus Richard Piers, if the story Joseph had told us was true. And I found it in the archives of the Hudson's Bay Company. There was a journal entry dated March 1854. It described the death of a trader named Augustus Piers, who had frozen to death on the Mackenzie River during a supply run. His partners had transported his body to Fort Simpson on a dog sled, and the journey had taken 17 days. And in the journal, one of the men wrote something that made my skin crawl. The whole way we could hear him shouting at the dogs, even though he was dead and wrapped in canvas. We could hear his voice clear as day. "Merrick," he said, "walk. Keep moving. I have not been back to the Northwest Territories since. I have not been dog sledding. I have not even gone camping in the winter, because I know now that there are places in this world where the past does not stay, buried, where the dead do not rest, and where, if you listen closely enough, you can still hear them calling out in the darkness, commanding, pleading, trying to finish journeys that will never end. I grew up in Sudbury, Ontario, and I spent most of my childhood camping and hiking in the forests around the city. By the time I was in my 22nd, I considered myself experienced in the backcountry. I knew how to read animal tracks, how to build a proper fire in wet conditions, how to navigate without a GPS. I was comfortable in the woods in a way that most people are not. So, when my girlfriend Emma suggested we go winter camping near Red Lake in northern Ontario, I did not hesitate. I had been to Red Lake before during the summer, and I knew it was beautiful. Remote, yes, but beautiful. What I did not know, what I could not have known, was that some places in the wilderness are remote for a reason. Some places are avoided, not because they are hard to reach, but because they should not be reached at all. We drove up in late January when the snow was deep and the temperatures were hovering around -20 during the day and dropping to -30 at night. We parked at a trailhead about 15 kilometers outside of Red Lake and hiked in on snowshoes, pulling our gear behind us on a sled. The plan was simple. 3 nights, 3 days. We would camp near a frozen lake, do some ice fishing, maybe see the northern lights if we were lucky, and then hike back out. Easy. We set up our tent on the second afternoon about 2 kilometers from the nearest logging road in a small clearing surrounded by dense black spruce and jack pine. The forest was quiet. Not the peaceful kind of quiet, the unsettling kind. No birds, no wind, just silence so thick it felt like it was pressing down on you. Emma noticed at first. "It is weird, right?" she said, looking around at the trees. "How quiet it is." I nodded. It was weird, but I chalked it up to the cold. Animals hunker down in extreme temperatures. Birds go quiet. It is normal. Or at least, that is what I told myself. That first night, we cooked dinner over a small fire, crawled into our sleeping bags, and tried to stay warm. The tent was good, rated for -40, but the cold still seeped in through the ground, through the walls, through every gap and seam. I fell asleep eventually, exhausted from the hike, but I woke up a few hours later to the sound of something moving outside the tent. Footsteps, heavy, deliberate footsteps crunching through the snow. I sat up, my heart pounding, and listened. The footsteps circled the tent slowly, methodically, like whatever was out there was taking its time, studying us. I reached over and shook Emma awake. "Do you hear that?" I whispered. She nodded, her eyes wide in the darkness. We lay there, frozen, listening to the footsteps circle us again and again. Oh, and then they stopped, right outside the tent door. We could hear breathing, low and ragged, like whatever was out there was standing just inches away from us, separated only by a thin layer of nylon. I grabbed my flashlight and unzipped the tent door, shining the light out into the night. Nothing, just snow and trees and darkness. I swept the beam across the clearing, looking for tracks, for eyes reflecting in the light, for anything. But there was nothing. The snow around our tent was completely undisturbed. No footprints, no marks, nothing. Emma grabbed my arm and pulled me back inside. What the hell was that? She whispered. I did not have an answer. I told her it was probably just a moose or a wolf passing by, that the snow was too powdery to hold tracks, that we were safe, but I did not believe it, and neither did she. We did not sleep the rest of that night. We just lay there listening, waiting for the footsteps to return. They did not. But when the sun came up and we finally crawled out of the tent, I saw something that made my stomach turn. Carved into the trunk of a tree about 10 feet from our tent were symbols, strange, jagged symbols that looked like they had been scratched into the bark with something sharp. I walked over to the tree and ran, my fingers over the markings. They were fresh. The exposed wood beneath the bark was still pale and sticky with sap. Emma came up beside me and stared at the symbols. "What are those?" she asked. I shook my head. I had no idea. They did not look like anything I had ever seen before. Not indigenous carvings, not trail markers, nothing recognizable. Just these strange angular shapes that seemed to twist and loop in on themselves. We decided to pack up and move our camp. We did not talk about it, but we both felt it. This spot was wrong. We loaded our gear back onto the sled and hiked deeper into the forest, putting as much distance between us and that clearing as we could. We found another spot near the lake, more open with better visibility, and we set up our tent again. But the feeling did not go away. That oppressive, suffocating silence, that sense that we were being watched. On a second night, it happened again. Footsteps. But this time, they were faster, more aggressive. Whatever was out there was not circling anymore. It was pacing back and forth in front of the tent like it was agitated. And then we heard something else. A sound that I will never forget as long as I live. A low, guttural growl that seemed to vibrate through the ground, through the air, through my chest. It was not a bear. It was not a wolf. It was something else. Something wrong. Emma was crying now, clutching my arm so hard her nails dug into my skin. "We need to leave," she said. "We need to leave, right now." But we could not. It was -30 outside, pitch black, and we were kilometers from the nearest road. Running would be suicide. So, we stayed. We huddled together in our sleeping bags, listening to that thing pace and growl outside our tent, and we prayed for the sun to come up. When it finally did, we burst out of the tent and started packing. We did not care about breakfast, about being careful with our gear, about anything except getting out of there as fast as possible. And that is when I saw it standing at the edge of the clearing, maybe 50 feet away, partially hidden behind a tree. It was tall, impossibly tall, at least 8 feet, maybe more. Its body was skeletal, emaciated, with skin stretched so tight over its bones that I could see every rib, every joint. Its arms were too long, hanging down past its knees, ending in hands with fingers like claws. And its head. God, its head. It had the skull of a deer, bleached white, and crowned with a massive set of antlers that were broken and twisted. But the worst part, the part that made me want to scream, were the eyes. They were human, eyes, dark and aware, and filled with a hunger that I could feel even from that distance. Emma saw it too. She grabbed my hand, and we ran. We abandoned half our gear, left the tent standing, and we ran. We ran through the snow, stumbling and falling and dragging ourselves back up, and we did not stop until we reached the logging road. I do not know if it followed us. I did not look back. When we finally got to the truck, we threw what little gear we had into the back and drove. We drove straight to Red Lake, to the nearest RCMP station, and we tried to tell them what we had seen. The officer listened politely, took notes, and then suggested that we had probably encountered a moose or a bear, and that the isolation and cold had played tricks on our perception. He did not believe us, and honestly, I do not blame him. If someone had told me this story a week earlier, I would not have believed them either. But I know what I saw. I know what we heard. And when I got home, I started researching. I looked up reports of strange sightings in northern Ontario, of unexplained encounters in the wilderness, and I found it. The Wendigo, an indigenous legend from the Algonquian tribes, describing a malevolent spirit that inhabits the forests of the northern regions. It is said to be a creature of insatiable hunger, a being that was once human but became possessed by an evil force after resorting to cannibalism. The descriptions matched what I had seen. The skeletal frame, the elongated limbs, the antler skull, the human eyes, everything. And the more I read, the more I realized that the symbols we had found carved into the tree were warnings, markers left by people who knew what lived in those woods. Markers telling us to stay away. I also learned that the area around Red Lake has a history. There have been disappearances, hunters who went into the forest and never came back, hikers whose bodies were found weeks later, their remains scattered and picked clean in ways that could not be explained by animal predation. And there have been reports going back decades of people hearing footsteps in the night, of seeing tall figures moving through the trees, of feeling that same overwhelming sense of dread that Emma and I felt. I have not been back to northern Ontario since. I have not been winter camping. I have not even gone hiking in the deep woods, because I know now that there are things out there that we do not understand, things that should not exist but do, things that are older and more dangerous than any animal, and that are always hungry. Emma and I broke up a few months after that trip. We tried to move on, tried to pretend it had not happened, but the experience changed us both. She started having nightmares, waking up, screaming about the thing standing outside our tent, and I started seeing it everywhere in shadows at the edge of my vision, in reflections, in windows in the dark corners of my apartment. My therapist says it is post-traumatic stress, that my brain is trying to process a terrifying experience, and it is manifesting as intrusive thoughts. Maybe she is right, but I do not think so, because sometimes late at night when I'm lying in bed, I can hear it. Those footsteps, that low, guttural growl, and I know it is still out there waiting, watching, hunting. I've always loved old hotels. There is something romantic about them, something that makes you feel like you're stepping back in time when you walk through their grand lobbies and ornate hallways. So, when I got offered a summer job at the Fairmont Bee Springs Hotel in Alberta, I jumped at the chance. This was not just any hotel. It was a castle, a massive stone fortress built in the Canadian Rockies in 1888, with turrets and towers and more than 700 rooms. It was the kind of place where royalty stayed, where movie stars vacationed, where history lived and breathed in every corner. I was hired as a housekeeper, which meant long hours and hard work, but I did not care. I was 19 years old, living in one of the most beautiful places on earth, and I was getting paid for it. What more could I want? The hotel had a reputation, of course. Everyone who worked there knew the stories. The ghost of the bride who died on her wedding day, the bellman who still worked the 9th floor, even though he had been dead for decades, the mysterious room 8 inner 73 that did not officially exist, but that guests sometimes claimed to see. I dismissed all of it as marketing, tourist bait stories designed to add a little thrill to the guest experience and keep people talking about the hotel long after they checked out. I did not believe in ghosts, not even a little bit. But that changed during my 3rd week on the job when I saw her for the first time. I was working the late shift, finishing up my rounds on the third floor when I heard music coming from the grand staircase. It was faint, like someone was playing a piano in another room, but the melody was old-fashioned. A waltz. Maybe something you would hear at a wedding 100 years ago. I walked to the top of the staircase and looked down. The lobby was empty. It was after midnight, and most of the guests were in their rooms. The front desk clerk was on the other side of the building, and the night manager was doing his rounds on the upper floors. I was alone, but the music kept playing soft and lilting, echoing through the empty space. And then I saw her. She was standing at the bottom of the staircase, looking up at me, a woman in a wedding dress. The dress was beautiful, all lace and silk and intricate beading with a long train that pulled on the floor behind her. Her veil was pulled back and her hair was styled in an elaborate updo pinned with flowers. She looked like she had just stepped out of a photograph from the 1930 seconds, and she was glowing. Not metaphorically, literally glowing. A soft golden light surrounded her, flickering like candlelight. I froze. My brain could not process what I was seeing. A woman in a wedding dress glowing, standing in the lobby of the hotel at midnight. She took a step toward the staircase, and that is when I saw the flames. They were small at first, just little licks of fire, crawling up the hem of her dress, but they spread fast. Within seconds, her entire gown was engulfed, the fabric blackened and curled, the lace disintegrating, the silk melting away, and she just stood there looking up at me with this expression of pure terror, her mouth open in a silent scream. I wanted to run down the stairs to help her to do something, but I could not move. I was paralyzed, rooted to the spot, my hands gripping the banister so hard my knuckles turned white. She started to climb the stairs slowly, one step at a time. The flames followed her, trailing behind her like the train of her dress, and I could smell it. Burning fabric, burning hair, burning flesh. It was the most horrible smell I have ever experienced. Acrid and sweet and nauseating all at once. She climbed higher, her eyes locked on mine, and I finally found my voice. I screamed, a raw, panicked scream that echoed through the entire lobby, and she vanished just like that. 1 second she was there burning and climbing toward me, and the next second she was gone. The flames, the smell, the music, all of it disappeared. I was alone again, standing at the top of the staircase, shaking so hard I thought I might collapse. The night manager came running, alerted by my scream, and found me sitting on the floor at the top of the stairs, crying and hyperventilating. He helped me to my feet and took me to the staff break room, where he made me sit down and drink a glass of water. I tried to tell him what I'd seen, but the words came out jumbled and incoherent. A bride on fire, climbing the stairs. He did not look surprised. He did not look skeptical. He just looked tired, like he had heard this story 100 times before. He sat down across from me and sighed. "You saw her?" he said. It was not a question. I nodded, still shaking. He leaned back in his chair and rubbed his eyes. Her name was Elizabeth, or at least that is what we call her. No one knows for sure who she was. The story goes that she was getting married here at the hotel back in the 1930 seconds. Big wedding, hundreds of guests, everything perfect. But during the reception, something went wrong. She was dancing near the grand staircase, and her dress got too close to one of the candelabras. The fabric caught fire. He paused, watching my reaction. I just stared at him, waiting for him to continue. She panicked, he said, started running. But that just made the fire worse. She ran up the grand staircase trying to get away from the flames. But they followed her. By the time someone managed to put the fire out, she was already dead. They say she died on the staircase right there where you saw her. I felt sick. Why does she keep coming back? I asked. The manager shrugged. No one knows. Maybe she does not know she is dead. Maybe she is still trying. to get away from the fire. Or maybe she is just stuck here reliving the worst moment of her life over and over again. People see her all the time. Guest, staff, even the maintenance crew. She always appears on the grand staircase. Always in her wedding dress. Always on fire. And she always climbs toward the spot where she died. I did not sleep that night. I could not. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her. That terrified expression, those flames crawling up her dress, that silent scream. The next day, I went to the hotel library and started digging through old records, trying to find out if the story was true. And I found it. An article from a local newspaper dated June 1932. It was brief, just a few paragraphs, but it confirmed everything the manager had told me. A bride had died at the Fairmont Bee Springs Hotel during her wedding reception. Her dress had caught fire from a candelabra. She had run up the grand staircase in a panic and had collapsed halfway up. She was pronounced dead at the scene. Her name was not Elizabeth. It was Catherine. Catherine Walsh. She was 23 years old. I kept working at the hotel for the rest of the summer, but I avoided the grand staircase as much as possible. I took the service elevators, used the back hallways, did everything I could to stay away from that spot. But I saw her again, twice more. Once from a distance, standing at the bottom of the stairs, just like the first time. And once up close, so close I could have reached out and touched her. That second encounter happened in late August, just a few days before I was supposed to go back to school. I was cleaning a room on the 3rd floor, and when I stepped out into the hallway, she was there, standing right in front of me. Her dress was already burning, the flames consuming her, and she was staring at me with those wide, terrified eyes. I could feel the heat radiating off her, could smell that awful burning smell. In this time, I heard her. She spoke. Her voice was barely a whisper, raspy and choked, but I heard every word. "Help me," she said. "Please help me." I wanted to help her. I wanted to do something, anything, to end her suffering. But I did not know how. I did not know what she needed. So, I just stood there frozen, tears streaming down my face, and watched as she turned and walked toward the staircase. She moved slowly, deliberately, her burning dress trailing behind her. And when she reached the top of the stairs, she looked back at me one last time, and then she started to descend, step by step, down the staircase toward the spot where she had died. And as she went, the flames grew brighter, hotter, until I could barely look at her. And then, halfway down, she collapsed, just like she must have done in 1932. Her body crumpled. The flames engulfed her completely. And then she was gone, vanished, leaving nothing behind but the crisis, faint smell of smoke. I quit the next day. I did not give notice. I just packed my things, left my uniform on the bed in my staff housing room, and drove home. I could not stay there anymore, could not walk those hallways knowing she was still there, still suffering, still burning. People ask me sometimes if I regret leaving, if I wish I had stayed and finished out the summer. And the truth is, I do not know. Part of me wishes I had tried harder to help her, wishes I had done some kind of research, found some way to give her peace. But another part of me knows that there was nothing I could do, that she is trapped in that moment, in that fire, and that no amount of prayer or ritual or good intentions can set her free. All I know is that I will never go back to that hotel, never walk those stairs, never stand in that spot where she died, because I know she is still there, still burning, still climbing, still begging for help that will never come. My family has been going to Alanquin Park since before I was born. It is a tradition. Every summer, we pack up the van and drive north from Toronto to spend a week camping, canoeing, and hiking through one of the most beautiful wilderness areas in Ontario. I have memories of building campfires with my dad, swimming in crystal clear lakes with my older brother, and falling asleep to the sound of loons calling across the water. Algonquin was always my happy place, a place where I felt safe and connected to nature. But that changed 3 years ago when my little sister Emily disappeared. She was only 6 years old at the time. It was our 4th day in the park, and we were hiking one of the easier trails near our campsite, a loop that was supposed to take about an hour. The trail was well marked, not too steep, and we had done it a dozen times before. My parents were leading the way. My brother was a few steps behind them, and I was walking with Emily, holding her hand and pointing out different types of trees and birds. Everything was normal, peaceful. The sun was shining through the canopy. The air smelled like pine and fresh earth. And Emily was chattering away about the chipmunks she had seen that morning. And then, in the span of maybe 30 seconds, she was gone. I had let go of her hand to tie my shoe. That was it. I crouched down, tied my lace, and when I stood up, she was not there. I looked around, expecting to see her a few feet ahead on the trail, maybe running to catch up with my parents, but she was not there. I called her name. No response. My parents turned around, their faces shifting from calm to concerned in an instant. We all started calling for her, our voices echoing through the trees. Emily, Emily, where are you? We searched the immediate area, spreading out but staying within sight of each other, combing through the underbrush and looking behind every tree and rock. Nothing. It was like she had vanished into thin air. My dad called park services, and within an hour, we had search teams combing the area. Rangers, volunteers, tracking dogs, even a helicopter. They searched for 6 hours, straight, covering miles of forest, checking every trail, every lakeshore, every possible place a little girl could have wandered. And they found nothing. No footprints, no torn clothing, no sign that she had ever been there at all. My mom was hysterical. My dad was pale and silent, his jaw clenched so tight I thought his teeth might crack. My brother and I just stood there numb, watching the search teams move through the forest like ghosts. As the sun started to set, the search coordinator told us they would have to suspend the search until morning. It was too dangerous to continue in the dark. My parents refused to leave. They set up a vigil at the trailhead, sitting by a campfire, waiting, hoping, praying that Emily would find her way back. I could not sleep that night. I just sat in the tent, staring at the canvas walls, replaying those 30 seconds over and over in my mind, letting go of her hand, tying my shoe, looking up. She was gone. How could she have disappeared so fast? Where could she have gone? The forest at night is a different place. All those comforting daytime sounds, the birds, the rustling leaves, the distant laughter of other campers, they disappear, and in their place comes something else. Silence. Deep, oppressive silence. And then just when you think you cannot stand it anymore, you hear things, branches snapping, footsteps, voices that are not quite human. I heard all of it that night, and I was convinced that something had taken my sister. Something that lived in the forest. Something we could not see or understand. At dawn, the search resumed. More teams, more dogs, more helicopters. They brought in thermal imaging equipment, hoping to pick up her body heat if she was hiding or unconscious somewhere. And then around noon, one of the search dogs started barking. The handler radioed in. They had found her. She was sitting by the edge of a lake, about 3 kilometers from where she had disappeared, just sitting there, calm, quiet, staring out at the water. My parents ran. I've never seen them move so fast. My mom was sobbing. My dad was shouting Emily's name, and when they reached her, they scooped her up and held her so tight I thought they might never let go. The paramedics checked her over. She was fine. Not a scratch on her. Not dehydrated. Not hypothermic, not traumatized, just fine. Like she had been sitting by that lake for 10 minutes instead of 16 hours. But when they asked her where she had been, what had happened, she could not explain it. Or maybe she would not. She just kept saying the same thing over and over. The gray children took me. We went to play in the caves. My parents exchanged looks. The search coordinator frowned. There are no caves in that part of Algonquin Park. The area is all granite and forest. No limestone, no cave, systems, nothing. The coordinator tried to explain this to Emily, tried to get her to describe what she had seen, where she had been, but she just shook her head and repeated the same words. The gray children. They wanted to play. They took me to the caves. My mom asked her what the gray children looked like. Emily said they were kids about her age, but their skin was gray, and they did not have any eyes, just smooth skin where their eyes should have been. And they held hands and walked in a circle and sang songs that she did not understand. The paramedics suggested she might be in shock, that her brain was creating a narrative to process the trauma of being lost in the woods. My parents accepted that explanation. They wanted to believe it. They wanted to believe that Emily had just wandered off, gotten disoriented, and spent the night hiding by the lake because she was scared, and that the story about the gray children was just her way of coping. But I did not believe it because Emily was not scared. She was calm, happy, even like she had just come back from a played date. And over the next few days, as we packed up and drove home, she kept talking about them, about the gray children, about the games they played, about the caves where they lived. And she kept drawing pictures, dozens of pictures, all of them the same. Gray stick figures with no eyes, holding hands in a circle, standing in front of what looked like a dark opening in the ground. My parents tried to distract her, tried to get her to talk about other things, but she was obsessed. She would wake up in the middle of the night and stand by the window, staring out at the backyard, whispering about how the gray children were calling her, how they wanted her to come back, how they missed her. My mom took her to a child psychologist who diagnosed her with theta post-traumatic stress and recommended therapy. The therapist worked with Emily for months, using play therapy and art therapy to help her process what had happened. And slowly, over time, she stopped talking about the gray children, stopped drawing the pictures, stopped standing by the window at night. My parents were relieved. They thought she was getting better. But I knew the truth. She had not forgotten. She was just keeping it to herself. I did some research after we got back. I wanted to know if anyone else had ever reported seeing gray children in Algonquin Park, if there were any legends or stories about caves that did not officially exist. And I found something. In 1987, 3 children disappeared in Algonquin Park. They were part of a summer camp group, and during a supervised hike, they wandered off the trail and were never seen again. The search lasted weeks. They brought in every resource available, but the children were never found. No bodies, no clothing, no evidence, nothing. The case went cold, and eventually the families held memorial services and tried to move on. But there were rumors, whispers among the park rangers and the locals that the children had not gotten lost, that they had been taken by something that lived in the forest, something that lured children away with promises of games and adventure, and that somewhere deep in the park, in places no one had mapped, there were caves, hidden caves, where things that should not exist made their homes. I also found reports from other hikers and campers, stories posted on obscure forums and paranormal websites, people who claim to have seen strange children in the woods, children with gray skin and no eyes, children who appeared out of nowhere and then vanished just as quickly. Some people said the children tried to lure them off the trail, beckoning them to follow, whispering promises of secret places and hidden wonders. Most people ran. A few followed. Those people were never heard from again. I showed the research to my parents, but they did not want to hear it. They said I was feeding into Emily's delusions, that I was making things worse by looking for explanations that did not exist. They told me to let it go, to move on, to be grateful that Emily was home and safe. So, I stopped talking about it, but I did not stop watching her. And I was right to be worried because 6 months after the Doe incident, Emily started sleepwalking. My mom found her one night standing in the backyard barefoot and in her pajamas, staring at the fence. My mom brought her back inside, tucked her into bed, and thought it was a one-time thing. But it happened again and again. Always the same. Emily would get out of bed in the middle of the night, walk downstairs, unlock the back door, and head toward the woods at the edge of our property. My parents installed locks on the doors that Emily could not reach. They put bells on her bedroom door so they would hear if she tried to leave. But it did not stop. She would try to leave every night, sometimes multiple times, and when my parents stopped her, she would cry. Big, heartbroken sobs, saying that the Gray children were waiting for her, that they were lonely, that she promised she would come back. The psychologist increased her sessions, put her on medication to help her sleep, but nothing worked. Emily was obsessed, consumed. She stopped eating, stopped playing, stopped doing anything except waiting for nighttime so she could try to leave. My parents were desperate. They talked about moving, about getting Emily away from any reminders of Algonquin Park, about starting over somewhere new. But before they could make a decision, something happened that changed everything. One night, I woke up to the sound of my mom screaming. I ran downstairs and found my parents in the backyard holding Emily. She was covered in dirt, her pajamas torn, her hands bloody from clawing at the ground. She had somehow gotten outside and had started digging a hole in the backyard, a deep hole, like she was trying to dig her way into the earth, into the cave. She kept talking about my dad called an ambulance, and Emily was admitted to a children's psychiatric hospital. She stayed there for 3 weeks. They ran tests, scans, evaluations, and they found nothing physically wrong with her. No brain abnormalities, no chemical imbalances, nothing that could explain her behavior. The doctors said it was a severe trauma response, that her mind had created this elaborate fantasy world as a way to cope with the terror of being lost in the woods, and that with time and treatment, she would recover. But I do not think she will because I know what happened to her. I know that the Gray children are real, that they took her to those caves, that they showed her something, and that they want her back. Emily is 9 now. She is on medication. She sees a therapist twice a week. She does not sleepwalk anymore. But sometimes late at night, I hear her talking in her room, whispering to someone who is not there, promising that she will come back, that she will find a way. And I know that one day she will. One day she will disappear again, and this time we will not find her. I've always been interested in family history, the kind of person who spends hours scrolling through ancestry, websites, piecing together old census records, and building elaborate family trees that go back centuries. It is a hobby that has brought me closer to understanding where I came from, who my ancestors were, and what kind of lives they lived. Most of the stories I uncovered were ordinary farmers, laborers, shopkeepers, people who lived quiet lives and left behind little more than a name and a date. But a few months ago, I stumbled across something that was anything but ordinary. I found a connection to Esther Cox, the woman at the center of one of the most famous and well-documented poltergeist cases in Canadian history, and I wish to God I had never made that discovery. It started innocently enough. I was going through records from Nova Scotia, tracing my mother's side of the family, when I found a marriage certificate from 1875. The bride's name was Sarah Cox, my great-great-grandmother, and her sister, listed as a witness, was Esther Cox. I recognized the name immediately. Anyone with even a passing interest in the paranormal knows about Esther Cox and the Amherst poltergeist. The case happened in the late 1872s in the small town of Amherst, Nova Scotia, and it was so well documented that a book was written about it in 1888. Esther was a young woman, barely 18, living with her sister and brother-in-law when strange things started happening. Objects flew through the air. Fires broke out spontaneously. Writing appeared on the walls, and Esther herself became the focus of the phenomena, her body swelling grotesquely, mysterious scratches appearing on her skin, and invisible forces attacking her in front of witnesses. The case was investigated by doctors, clergymen, and skeptics alike, and no one could explain it. Some believed Esther was possessed. Others thought she was a fraud using trickery to gain attention. But the most compelling theory, the one that made the most sense to me, was that the poltergeist activity was connected to trauma. Esther had been assaulted by a man shortly before the phenomena began, a traumatic experience that she never fully processed. And somehow that trauma manifested as physical, tangible energy that wreaked havoc on everything around her. I read everything I could find about the case. Old newspaper articles, court documents, the book written by Walter Hubble, a man who lived with the family and witnessed the activity firsthand. And the more I read, the more disturbed I became, because the phenomena did not just involve objects moving or fires starting. It involved threats, messages burned into the walls, messages like, "Esther Cox, you are mine to kill." I became obsessed. I wanted to know more about Esther, about what happened to her after the phenomena stopped, about whether she ever found peace. I tracked down records and discovered that she had lived a hard life. She married, had children, moved around a lot, and eventually died in obscurity in 1912. There were no more reports of poltergeist activity after she left Amherst, and most people assumed that whatever had haunted her had finally let her go. But I was not so sure, because the more I researched, the more I felt like I was being watched, like something was paying attention to what I was doing. It started small, little things that I could easily dismiss. My computer would freeze when I was reading about Esther. My phone would glitch and display random symbols instead of text. Lights in my apartment would flicker for no reason. I told myself it was just old wiring, bad software, coincidence. But then the object started moving. It happened for the first time on a Tuesday night. I was sitting at my desk, going through scanned images of old documents, when a book flew off the shelf behind me and hit the wall. Not fell, flew like someone had picked it up and thrown it with force. I spun around, my heart racing, and stared at the shelf. There was no one there. No open windows, no drafts, no explanation. I picked up the prize book and put it back on the shelf, my hands shaking, and tried to convince myself that it had just been stacked precariously and had fallen. But I knew that was not true. I knew something else was happening. Over the next few days, the activity escalated. More books fell. Picture frames would tilt on the walls. My coffee mug slid across the table while I was sitting right there watching it. And then the fire started. Small fires, nothing catastrophic. A dish, towel on the counter would suddenly burst into flames. A piece of paper on my desk would start smoking and then ignite. I would put them out quickly, frantically, my mind racing with fear and confusion. I had my apartment inspected. The electrician found nothing wrong. The landlord suggested I was being careless, leaving candles unattended or smoking in bed. But I did not smoke. I did not have candles, and I was not being careless. Something was happening, something that I could not explain and could not control. And then, one night, I saw the writing. I woke up around 3, 0 inches the morning to the smell of smoke. I jumped out of bed and ran to the living room, expecting to find another fire. But there was no fire. Just smoke. Thick, acrid smoke filling the room. And on the wall above my desk, burned into the paint in large jagged letters, were the words, "You are mine to kill." I screamed. I ran out of the apartment in my pajamas and called the police from the hallway. They came, they investigated, they took pictures, and they told me it looked like someone had used a blowtorch or a cigarette lighter to burn the words into the wall. They asked if I had any enemies, if anyone had a key to my apartment, if I had been threatened recently. I told them no. I told them about the research I had been doing, about Esther Cox, about the poltergeist. They looked at me like I was insane. One of the officers suggested I see a therapist. The other suggested I install security cameras. Neither of them believed me. And honestly, I did not blame them. If someone had told me this story a month earlier, I would not have believed them either, but it kept happening. The fires, the objects, moving, the messages. More words appeared on my walls, on my mirrors, scratched into the frost on my windows in the morning. Mine. You cannot escape. Esther. Always Esther. Always referencing her like whatever had tormented her in the 1,870 seconds, had followed the bloodline down through the generations and had found me. I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I was terrified to be in my own apartment, but I had nowhere else to go. My friends thought I was having a breakdown. My family thought I was stressed from work. No one believed that this was real. No one except me. And then I had an idea. If this thing was connected to Esther, if it had followed her family line, then maybe I could sever that connection. Maybe I could break the link. I gathered every document I had related to Esther, every printout, every scanned image, every note I had taken. I piled them all in the bathtub, doused them with lighter fluid, and set them on fire. I watched them burn, the flames consuming the paper, the smoke rising and triggering the fire alarm. And as the last piece of paper turned to ash, I felt something shift. The oppressive, suffocating feeling that had been hanging over me for weeks lifted. The air felt lighter, clearer. I cleaned up the ashes, aired out the apartment, and waited. Nothing happened. No fires, no moving objects, no messages. For the first time in weeks, I felt like I could breathe. I thought it was over. I thought I had won. But I was wrong, because a week later, I made a mistake. I was cleaning out my email and found an old message I had sent to myself, an attachment, a scanned copy of Esther's death certificate that I had saved as a backup. I should have deleted it. I should have left it alone. But curiosity got the better of me. I opened it, and that night, it started again. Worse than before. The fires were bigger. The objects flew with more force, and the messages were everywhere, on every surface, in every room. You cannot escape. You are mine, Esther. I realized then that it was not about the physical documents. It was about the knowledge, the connection, the fact that I knew about Esther, that I had sought her out, that I had made myself part of her story. And now I was stuck in it, trapped in the same cycle of terror that she had endured over a century ago. I moved out of that apartment. I left everything behind. My furniture, my books, my research. I moved to a different city, changed my phone number, and tried to start over. But it followed me. It always follows me. The fires are less frequent now. The objects do not move as often, but the messages still appear on foggy mirrors, on frosted windows, scratched into the dust on my car. Always the same words. You're mine, Esther. I've tried everything. Therapists, priests, paranormal investigators, mediums. Some of them tell me it is all in my head. Others tell me I am cursed. One medium told me that Esther had been possessed by something malevolent, something that fed on trauma and fear, and that by researching her, by connecting myself to her, I had invited that same entity into my life. She told me the only way to break free was to confront the trauma, to understand it, to take away its power. But I do not know how to do that. I do not know how to fight something I cannot see, something that has been terrorizing women in my family for generations. All I know is that I'm tired of running, tired of being afraid, tired of waking up every morning, wondering what new horror will appear on my walls. I have stopped researching my family history. I have stopped looking into the past, because I have learned that some things are better left buried. Some stories are better left untold, and some connections are better left unmade. But it is too late for me. I opened the door. I invited it in. And now, like Esther, before me, I'm trapped in a nightmare that I cannot escape. The only difference is that Esther eventually found peace when she died. But I'm not so sure I will, because this thing, whatever it is, has made it very clear. I'm not just connected to Esther's story. I am part of it, and it will not let me go. I have driven the Trans-Canada Highway more times than I can count. But there is one stretch that I will never forget, a section of road near Dead Man's Flats in Alberta, just west of Calgary, where the highway cuts through the mountains and follows the Bow River. It is beautiful during the day, with snow-capped peaks rising on either side and the Peat River rushing alongside the road. But at night, it is a different place entirely, empty, dark, isolated. And on one particular night in February of 2021, I learned why the area has the name it does, why locals avoid that stretch of highway after dark, and why some places in this country carry their history like a curse that never fades. I was driving back to Calgary from a work trip in B. It was late, around 3:00 the morning, and I was exhausted. I had been at a conference all week, sitting through presentations and networking events, and all I wanted was to get home, crawl into bed, and sleep for 12 hours straight. The highway was empty, not a single car ahead of me or behind me, just my headlights cutting through the darkness and the yellow lines disappearing under my wheels. I had the radio on, some late-night talk show that I was not really listening to, and I was running on autopilot, eyes on the road, hands on the wheel, mind somewhere else entirely. And then my car started making a sound, a grinding, rattling sound that seemed to be coming from the engine. I swore under my breath and pulled over onto the shoulder, turning on my hazard lights and hoping it was something simple, a loose belt maybe, or a problem with the exhaust. I grabbed my flashlight from the glove compartment and got out, popping the hood and peering at the engine. I am not a mechanic, but I know enough to check for obvious problems. Everything looked fine. No loose parts, no leaking fluids, nothing that would explain the sound. I stood there for a moment, shivering in the cold, trying to decide whether I should risk driving the rest of the way home or call for roadside assistance. That is when I heard it, a rhythmic sound coming from the treeing about 50 yards away. It sounded like chopping, like someone was splitting wood, slow and steady, thunk, thunk, thunk. I turned and shone my sick flashlight toward the trees, but I could not see anything, just darkness and shadows, and the faint outline of pines against the night sky. The chopping continued, thunk, thunk, thunk. I told myself it was probably just a local cutting firewood, someone who lived nearby and worked odd hours, but something about it felt wrong. Who splits wood at 3:00 the morning, and why out here so far from any houses? I stood there listening, my breath steaming in the cold air. And then I saw movement, a figure, tall and broad-shouldered, emerging from the treeing and walking toward the river. He was carrying something long and heavy that he was dragging behind him through the snow. I could not make out what it was from where I stood, but the way he moved, the deliberate labored steps, suggested it was something substantial, a log maybe, or a large piece of equipment. I watched as he reached the edge of the Bow River, stopped, and then bent down. He appeared to be pushing or shoving whatever he was, carrying into the water. And then he straightened up, turned, and looked directly at me. I felt ice run through my veins. Even from that distance, even in the darkness, I could feel his eyes on me, staring, assessing. He did not move, did not call out, just stood there, watching me, while the sound of the river filled the silence. I did not wait to see what he would do next. I jumped back, in my car, slammed the door, locked it, and started the engine. To my relief, the grinding sound was gone. Whatever had been wrong with the car had apparently fixed itself, or maybe there had never been anything wrong at all. I pulled back onto the highway and drove, fast, faster than I should have been driving on that winding stretch of road, but I did not care. I needed to get away from that place, away from that figure standing by the river, away from the feeling that I had just witnessed, something I was not supposed to see. I did not stop again until I reached the outskirts of Calgary, pulling into a 24-hour gas station and sitting in the parking lot with the engine running, trying to calm my racing heart. I told myself I had overreacted, that it was just someone out doing work, that the isolation and the late hour had played tricks on my perception. But I could not shake the image of that figure, the way he had stared at me, the way he had been dragging something heavy toward the river. The next day, I did some research. I wanted to know more about Dead Man's Flats, about why the area had that name, and what I found chilled me to the bone. The name comes from a murder that took place in 1904. Two brothers, Francois and Jean Ger, ran a small dairy farm near the Bow River. They had immigrated from France a few years earlier and were trying to make a life for themselves in the Canadian wilderness. But they did not get along. They argued constantly about money, about the farm, about everything. And on a cold February night, their arguments came to a violent end. According to historical records, Francois killed his brother Jean with an axe. He struck him multiple times, then dragged his body to the Bow River and tried to dispose of it in the water. But the body washed up a few days later, and Francois was arrested, tried, and hanged for the Bras murder. The area became known as Dead Man's Flats in honor of Jean Girl, the man who had been killed there. But the story did not end with the trial. Over the years, people have reported seeing strange things near the site of the old Gurley farm. A man with an axe standing by the river, the sound of chopping, the sound of something heavy being dragged through the snow, and sightings always happen on the same night. The anniversary of the murder, February 12th. I checked the date on my phone. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely hold it. February 12th. The exact date. I had broken down on the exact spot where Francois had killed his brother and dragged his body to the river, and I had seen him or something that looked like him reenacting the murder, reliving that terrible night over and over again. I felt sick. I felt like the ground had dropped out from under me, because I knew what I had seen was not a living person. No one splits wood at 3:0 inches the morning in the middle of nowhere. No one drags something that heavy toward a river for no reason. And no one stares at a stranger with that kind of cold, empty intensity, unless they are not really there at all. I have driven that stretch of highway many times since then. During the day, it is fine, beautiful even. But I will never drive it at night again, especially not on February 12th, because I know what happens there. I know that Francois Girl is still out there, still dragging his brother's body to the river, still trapped in the worst moment of his life. And I know that if you are unlucky enough to be in that spot at the right time, you will see him, too. You will hear the chopping. You will see the figure moving through the darkness, and you will feel those eyes on you, cold and empty and filled with a rage that has not faded in over 100 years. I also learned something else during my research, something that made the whole experience even more unsettling. According to local historians, the site of the Gurley farm is not marked. There is no plaque, no memorial, nothing to indicate where it stood. But people who have studied the case say it was located near a specific bend in the river, right where the highway curves and the tree line presses close to the road, right where I broke down, right where I saw the figure. I do not know if Francois is trying to communicate something or if he is simply trapped in an endless loop, doomed to repeat his crime for eternity. But I do know that he is still there, still chopping, still dragging, still staring out at the road, watching for witnesses who might stumble across his terrible secret. Some people have asked me why I did not report what I saw to the police, why I did not try to investigate further to see if there was something in the river, some evidence that could shed light on what I had witnessed. The truth is, I was too scared, too shaken, and I did not think anyone would believe me. What would I have told them that I saw a ghost, that I witnessed a murder that happened over 100 years ago? They would have thought I was crazy, or drunk, or making the whole thing up for attention. So, I kept it to myself. I told a few close friends, people who I knew would not judge me, but for the most part, I stayed silent until now. I am sharing this story because I want people to know. I want people to be aware that some places in this country carry their history in ways that are not always visible, that the past does not always stay buried, and that if you find yourself driving through Dead Man's Flats late at night, especially on February 12th, you might want to keep your eyes on the road. Do not look toward the river. Do not pay attention to any sounds you might hear coming from the trees. And if your car breaks down, if you find yourself stranded on the side of the highway in the middle of the night, do not get out. Do not investigate. Just call for help and wait in your vehicle with the doors locked until someone arrives. Because Francois is still out there, still swinging his axe, still dragging his brother's body through the snow. And if he sees you watching him, if he locks eyes with you the way he did with me, you will never forget it. You will carry that image with you for the rest of your life. That cold, empty stare, that sense of ancient rage and endless guilt, that feeling that you have just looked into the face of something that should not exist but does. I still drive the Trans-Canada Highway. I still make that trip between Calgary and BA several times a year for work, but I plan my routes carefully. Now, I make sure I am never on that stretch of road after dark. I make sure I am never anywhere near Dead Man's Flats on February 12th because I have seen what happens there. I have seen the ghost of Francois, and I never want to see him again. I've never been one to believe in the supernatural. I was raised in a practical no-nonsense household where ghost stories were dismissed as entertainment and nothing more. My parents were both engineers, logical thinkers who believed in science and evidence and rational explanations for everything. So when my friend suggested we spend a weekend at a cottage in Muskoka, Ontario, and bring along an Ouija board for fun, I laughed it off as a silly game, something we would do for entertainment, maybe get a little spooked, and then forget about by Monday morning. I had no idea that what started as a joke would become the most terrifying experience of my life, and I had no idea that some doors once opened are almost impossible to close. It was late October, the weekend before Halloween, and there were 5 of us. Me, my best friend Claire, her boyfriend, Mark, and 2 other friends from university, Sophie and Alex. We rented a small cottage on Lake Muskoka, one of those rustic places with wood-paneled walls, a stone fireplace, and windows that looked out over the dark water. The plan was simple: spend the weekend hiking, drinking wine by the fire, and telling scary stories. It was supposed to be relaxing, a break from midterms and the stress of school. On the first night after dinner, Claire pulled out the Ouija board. She had bought it at a vintage shop in Toronto, an old wooden board with ornate lettering and a planchette made of smooth, polished wood. She said it would be fun, that we could try to contact spirits and see what happened. I was skeptical, but I agreed to play along. We all did. We set up the board on the coffee table in the living room, turned off the lights, and lit candles. The atmosphere was perfect, flickering shadows on the walls, the sound of wind rustling through the trees outside, the crackle of the fire in the background. We all placed our fingers lightly on the planchette, and Claire asked the first question. "Is anyone there?" For a long moment, nothing happened. We sat in silence, waiting, half expecting the planchette to move, but not really believing it would. And then it did. Slowly at first, just a gentle drift toward the word yes at the top of the board. We all looked at each other. Someone was pushing it. Someone had to be pushing it, but everyone denied it. We tried again. Claire asked, "Who are you?" The planchette moved again. This time, faster, more deliberate. It spelled out a name, Margaret. We asked more questions. "How old are you? Where are you? Why are you here?" And the planchette kept moving, spelling out answers that seemed too specific, too detailed, to be random. Margaret said she was 32 years old, that she had lived in Muskoka in the late 1972, that she had 3 children, and that she had drowned them in the lake before hanging herself in the attic of a cottage, the same cottage we were staying in. The mood in the room shifted. What had started as a fun game suddenly felt sinister. Claire asked if Margaret was still in the cottage, and the planchette moved to yes. She asked if Margaret wanted something from us, and it spelled out help. And then, without any of us moving our hands, the planchette flew off the board and hit the wall with a loud crack. The candles went out, all of them at the same time. We sat there in complete darkness, the only sound our panicked breathing and the fire crackling in the background. And then we heard it. Laughter. Children's laughter, coming from upstairs from the attic. Mark grabbed a flashlight, and we all followed him up the narrow staircase to the second floor. There was a small door at the end of the hallway, painted white and barely noticeable against the wall. None of us had even realized it was there when we arrived. Mark opened it, revealing a steep ladder leading up into the attic. He climbed up, shining the flashlight around, and the rest of us waited below, our hearts pounding. After a moment, he came back down, his face pale. "There is nothing up there," he said, "just old furniture and boxes." But we could still hear it, the laughter, faint and distant, like it was coming from somewhere we could not reach. We went back downstairs, packed up the Ouija board, and tried to convince ourselves that it was just the wind, just the old cottage settling, just our imaginations running wild. But none of us believed it. We had heard those children. We had felt the presence of something in that room, something that was not supposed to be there. The next morning, I did some research. I pulled up old newspaper archives on my phone, searching for any information about drownings or suicides in Muskoka cottages, and I found it. An article from 1978. A woman named Margaret Holloway had drowned her 3 children, ages 4, 6, and 8, in Lake Muskoka. She had taken them out in a boat in the middle of the night, weighted them down with rocks, and pushed them into the water. Then she returned to the cottage, went up to the attic, and hanged herself from the rafters. The article did not specify which cottage it had happened in, but it said the property was located on the northern shore of the lake, exactly where we were staying. I showed the article to the others, and we all felt sick. The details matched perfectly. The name, the children, the attic, everything the Ouija board had told us was true. We decided to leave. We packed up our things, cleaned the cottage, and were getting ready to drive back to Toronto when Sophie noticed something. The Ouija board was gone. We had packed it in a box the night before, stored it in the closet, and planned to throw it away when we got home. But the box was empty. The board and the planchette were missing. We searched the entire cottage, every room, every closet, every corner. Nothing. It was like the board had vanished into thin air. We left without it, driving in tense silence, each of us lost in our own thoughts. I told myself it was over, that whatever we had contacted, whatever we had disturbed, was staying at the cottage, that once we were back in the city, back in our normal lives, everything would be fine. But I was wrong, because 3 days later, I started seeing the messages. It started with my bathroom mirror. I had just gotten out of the shower, and the mirror was fogged up from the steam, and written in the condensation in clear, deliberate letters were the words, "Why did you call us?" I froze, staring at the message, my heart hammering in my chest. I wiped it away with my hand, telling myself it was a prank. That one of my roommates was messing with me. But my roommates were not home. I was alone, in the apartment. The next morning, I found another message. This time, it was scratched into the frost on my car window. The same words, "Why did you call us?" I took a picture, showed it to Claire, and she went pale. She had been seeing messages too, on her laptop screen when she woke up in the middle of the night, on the mirror in her dorm room, on the fogged glass of her shower door. Always the same question. Why did you call us? We tried to ignore it. We tried to rationalize it. Maybe we were just paranoid. Maybe the whole experience at the cottage had messed with our heads, and we were seeing things that were not really there. But the messages kept coming, and they were getting more frequent, more insistent. I would wake up in the middle of the night to find words written on my bedroom wall in what looked like soot or ash. "We are waiting. You open the door. We are here." I stopped sleeping. I stopped eating. I was terrified to be alone, terrified to close my eyes, terrified that whatever I had contacted with that Ouija board was now following me. Claire was in the same state. She was having nightmares every night, waking up screaming, seeing figures standing at the foot of her bed. Mark had broken up with her, saying he could not handle the stress, that he thought she was having a breakdown. Sophie and Alex had stopped answering our calls. They wanted nothing to do with what was happening. I did more research. I read everything I could find about Ouija boards, about how to close spiritual connections, about how to protect yourself from negative entities. And I learned that when you use an Ouija board, you are supposed to say goodbye. You are supposed to move the planchette to the word goodbye on the board to properly close the session. We had not done that. When the planchette flew off the board and the candles went out, we had panicked, we had run, and we had left the session open, which meant that whatever we had contacted, whatever spirits or entities had come through, were still connected to us, still able to reach us, still trying to communicate. I needed to close the door. I needed to end the connection. But I did not have the board. It was gone, lost somewhere in that cottage, or taken by something that did not want us to close the connection. I decided to go back. It was the only option I had. I needed to find that board, or I needed to go to the place where we had opened the connection and try to close it properly. Claire refused to come with me. She said she could not go back there, that she would rather live with the nightmares than face whatever was in that cottage again. So, I went alone. I drove to Muskoka on a cold November afternoon, the sky gray and heavy with the promise of snow. I parked outside the cottage and sat in my car for a long time, trying to work up the courage to go inside. The place looked different in the daylight, less sinister, just a small, weathered cottage by a lake. But I could feel it, that same oppressive, suffocating presence that I had felt the night we used the Ouija board. I grabbed a bag of supplies I had brought with me: salt, sage, candles. a handwritten prayer I had found online, and I went inside. The cottage was dark and cold. The power had been shut off since we left, and the only light came from the windows. I walked through the rooms, my footsteps echoing on the wooden floors, and I could feel eyes on me watching, waiting. I went to the living room, to the spot where we had set up the board, and I laid out my supplies. I lit the candles, scattered the salt in a circle around me, and burned the sage, letting the smoke fill the room. And then I spoke out loud to whatever was there. I apologized. I told Margaret that I was sorry for disturbing her, sorry for opening the connection without knowing how to close it properly. I told her that I wanted to help, that I wanted to give her peace, but that I needed her to let me go, to let all of us go. For a long moment, nothing happened. And then the temperature in the room dropped. My breath came out in white clouds, and I could see frost forming on the windows. And I heard it, that laughter, the children. But this time, it was not coming from upstairs. It was all around me, surrounding me, closing in. I started to panic. I grabbed the prayer and read it out loud, my voice shaking, my hands trembling. And as I spoke, the laughter grew louder, more frantic. And then it stopped. All at once, the silence was deafening. I stood there in the circle of salt, holding my breath, waiting for something to happen. And then I heard a voice, a woman's voice, soft and sad and filled with regret. "I cannot let you go," she said, "because you are the only ones who know I am here. You are the only ones who remember." I felt tears streaming down my face. I told her that I would remember, that I would tell her story, that I would make sure people knew what happened to her and her children, and I promised that I would never forget. The presence lifted, the oppressive feeling in the room faded, and I felt something shift, like a door closing, like a weight being lifted. I packed up my supplies, left the cottage, and drove home. The messages stopped after that, the frost on the windows, the words on the mirrors, the figures in the shadows. All of it stopped. Claire said her nightmares stopped, too, that she finally felt like she could breathe again. But I kept my promise. I told Margaret's story. I researched the details of what happened in 1978, found records of the investigation, and I wrote about it. I wanted people to know, to remember, because Margaret Holloway and her 3 children deserve to be remembered, not just as a tragedy, but as human beings who suffered and died in that cottage. And I hope, wherever they are now, they have found peace. But I will never use an Ouija board again, and I will never open a door without knowing how to close it.